They say a church hush can swallow almost anything. On that Sunday in late spring, the hush at Ebenezer Baptist did more than swallow, it recoiled. A small boy's voice cut through the pews like a broken bell. "Don't marry her!" It wasn't the sort of interruption the congregation expected. It wasn't meant to be theatrical. It was a warning anchored in 10 years of watching and a promise he had made at a hospital bedside. This is the story behind that scream. Child's wedding crash shocking reveal, why he screamed, "Don't marry her," at Dad's ceremony. It begins not with a wedding, but with a hallway shove and the insistence of a dying woman who trusted her son with an impossible charge. The shove happened in a narrow passage off the kitchen, where sunlight through the magnolia tree fell in lace on the linoleum. Will's small shoulder hit the wall. Monica's fingers were on his upper arm, hard enough to bruise but not to leave the sort of mark someone would ask about. Her voice was low and sharp, the kind of voice that made neighbors draw their curtains and pretend they didn't hear. "You're trouble," she said. "You make your father worry." Will didn't cry. He didn't let her see that his heart felt like a fist. He had learned early how to keep his breath measured, how to let the house feel bigger than it was. He had learned most of that watching his mother get smaller in a hospital room, a soft woman whose hands smelled of coconut oil and the kind of perfume she only wore on Sundays. Carolyn Davis's last eyes were steady when she said, "Take care of your daddy." Will had promised. He had sharpened that promise into something like armor. Maple Street is the kind of block where porches sag under the weight of decades and the smell of collard greens on a Wednesday can be a social event. The Davis house stood with 3 generations tucked into its walls, a portrait of Carolyn above the mantel, Wesley's tools hung on a pegboard in the garage, and the small plastic bat Will kept by his bed. After Carolyn died, the house grew quieter in a way that made the echoes heavy. Wesley moved through the rooms like a man walking a museum of their life, fingertips brushing the back of a sofa because memory felt to him like a matter of touch. Monica arrived with casseroles and a laugh that managed both loudness and intimacy. She had found Wesley at the grief group in the church basement, a neutral space of coffee urns and folding chairs where widowers and widows learned to name their days again. She was good at listening, at holding a hand for a little too long, at noticing when the salt in the soup was too little. The community, weary from the slow business of comforting, let her in. Grief makes people generous. It makes them look for anchors. To Will, she offered the practical things grief does not provide, a motherly figure who could pour lemonade without spilling, who straightened his bedspread, who told him that grief could be fixed with a new rug and a glass of sweet tea. She wrapped herself around Wesley like a ribbon. She rearranged photographs. She placed potted palms on the back porch and bought yellow curtains that made the kitchen glow, as if light could substitute for absence. But a child notices the seams. Will noticed the times she moved with too precise a calm. He noticed the small things adults passed over, Monica's phone held tight in her palm, the tone gone when she spoke, the way she paused before she answered a question about her own family. He noticed the late-night trips outside beneath a thin sky. He noticed that sometimes there was an unfamiliar name whispered on her side of the line. The first clear clue came at 2:14 in the morning. Will was awake because he always was awake long after his father. Wesley slept as if he were a man trying to regain lost weight by resting, and he heard a muffled voice through the door. Monica's laugh, light and practiced. A man's voice on the other end answering something like, "Rachel, yeah." The name landed in Will like a stone in a pond. It rippled. Rachel. He'd been told her name was Monica Turner. He wrote it fast in the margins of his school notebook, the letters cramped and small. The notebook was his true thing. It began as a school composition book, blue cover, foxing at the edge. He turned the first page into a registry of small betrayals, dates, times, odd phrases, things like 2:14 a.m., Rachel on phone, and Monica bought a new lock, 4-7. He drew little maps of the house, where the lemonade pitcher sat, where the spare keys were kept, and sketched faces, not cruelly but with a child's need to understand the geometry of adults' movements. When Carolyn's voice came back to him in memory, it was always urging attention. "See what's happening, Will." So he did. Wesley, who moved through grief like he was cataloging the world in dull ink, was slow to notice the things Will did. He saw Monica as a balm, someone who learned the names of his friends and could read a casserole recipe off memory. Wesley's grief made him both gullible and grieful. He spoke of Carolyn in the present tense sometimes, as if the way he remembered her could hold her there. He would not, at first, entertain accusations. To accuse someone who brought you a clean shirt and a home-cooked meal felt wrong in a way Will could not explain. There were other small incidents. Monica, on an errand, stepped out to the CVS on Maple and came back with a receipt that stubbed like a white lie in Will's hand. Antifreeze, a pair of work gloves. She laughed when Will pointed at it. "Tried it out of the gutter," she said. "You boys are always imagining things." Her laugh had that precise practice quality again. Will wrote it down.
One afternoon, after a Mother's Day of church hymns and a potluck where the collard greens tasted like something Wesley had never quite mastered, Will followed Monica into the back bedroom when she said she was tidying. She closed the door for a fraction of a second, and he heard her voice move into that low, private rhythm. He didn't stay long. He went back to his notebook and wrote, "Monica says she's Rachel" to someone on phone. He didn't know why it mattered. He only knew that his mother's promise had given him a lens he could not put aside. At Sunday after service, when the church's organ sighed and the light through the stained glass leaned across the aisle, Will sat with Denise Brooks at the far end. Denise had been a friend of Carolyn's for a long time. She was a forensic nurse, a title that sounded the way the woman herself looked. Precise, pragmatic, hands that were never still. She liked the Davis pair. She'd brought black-eyed peas to the house the week after Carolyn's funeral and had listened to Wesley with a steadiness that wasn't pity so much as competent grief-sharing. Will had seen her once when he was small, kneeling by Carolyn's bedside, her face hard with concentration, and then soft with something else. She had an uncanny ability to translate details into patterns. She could look at a bruise and sketch a story from it without ever being cruel. That afternoon, Will, who had been watching Denise for weeks as if she were part of the furniture, mustered the kind of courage only a child can find when urgency sharpens the tongue. He climbed up onto the pew, reached for Denise's hand as she stood to leave, and whispered, "My mom told me to keep Daddy safe. I think the lady who moved in is hurting him." Denise's eyebrow rose, and for a second she regarded him like a case file. She let him talk. He gave her the notebook, the small, battered blue cover. He didn't ask permission. He couldn't have. For Will, the book was less a secret and more a ledger of duty. Denise read it with professional calm, her eyes tracking the neat, tiny script. Names, times, the 2:14 a.m. note, the receipt, the map of the house. "Why didn't you tell your dad?" Denise asked quietly when the church had emptied and sunlight warmed the floorboards. "Because he loves her," Will said, "and because Mom said to." He could have added that Wesley had a way of not hearing the things children said that made adults uncomfortable. He could have said that at 10 you understood too much and too little all at once. He simply said, "Please, you know how to look." Denise did know how to look. Over the next week, she began doing what she could with the soft tools at her disposal. Public records, a whiteboard on the back porch, and the kind of quiet inquiries that don't look like investigations until they are. She found an obituary that was thin and quick, a marriage certificate that read like someone checking boxes, a civil complaint filed by a woman named Lisa Foster, who called herself the sister of a man who had died shortly after marrying the same woman now living in Wesley's house. The complaint alleged undue influence and suspicious circumstances. It was filled with the cautious language of someone who had been told to keep things urgent but measured, the kind of tentative bravery that takes an outsider longer to accept. Denise pinned the documents under a magnolia leaf on the back table. "Pattern," she said more to herself than to Will. She circled dates and beneficiary listings on photocopies. "People change their beneficiaries for many reasons," she said aloud. "People make mistakes, but pattern and timing, those are things that make a story look less like coincidence." Will watched her with a solemnity that made Denise's mouth tighten. "You did this?" he asked, gesturing to his notebook, as if the thing itself were the engine that had started the engine. "I helped you read it," she replied. Her hands were steady. She had the patience of a woman who had written many reports and held many families' shock in soft professional palms. "We need more, Will. We need the kind of things the police will take seriously." The police, where they existed in this story, existed as polite, procedural figures. Detective Harris was the rational one assigned to officers on Maple Street. He drove a car with the city seal and wore shoes that could slide over suspicion like oil. When Denise brought him photocopies, he squinted at the dates and names and nodded like a man being cautious with his pen. He didn't laugh. He didn't close the file. But he also didn't say, "We will arrest her tomorrow." That would have been television. In real life, he said, "This gives us a direction. We will need definitive evidence." Definitive evidence is the slow, awkward thing of investigations. It is lab reports and receipts that tie into a chain that doesn't break. It is a sample that was collected with procedure and stamped and placed in a controlled environment that can be presented in court without a defense attorney poking holes with questions about a sandwich bag or a neighbor who found it. Denise tried to make things as solid as she could. She took a small cup from beside the lemonade pitcher during a Sunday when Monica was babysitting a niece. She did it with the quiet stealth of a woman who had once had to collect traces of a crime scene without haunting the living. She placed the plastic specimen in a sealed envelope and tucked it into her bag under a folded church bulletin. Will watched every move like a small judge. He did not like secrets, but he trusted Denise's competence to use them well. The next day, Denise called Detective Harris. She explained gently but firmly that there were suspicious patterns and that she had a sample. Harris's voice over the phone was careful. "Chain of custody," he said. "We need it handled in a way that doesn't give a defense an opening." Denise understood. She tried to hand the sample over directly. She tried to explain what she had found in public records: Lisa Foster's civil complaint, the odd spikes in beneficiary changes, the obituary with an absence of close family listed. She described in concise language how 2 previous husbands had ended with similar symptoms that suggested a slow poisoning. Not violent, but insistent, a breakdown that looked at first glance like disease. Harris listened. He reminded her that people die every day of illnesses that mimic those symptoms. He reminded her that accusation is heavy. He promised to send someone by to look at the records. He promised, reluctantly, not to make promises. By then, Monica had begun to show a different face. When confronted with a polite but probing set of questions from a neighbor about why she had been at the pharmacy at odd hours, she smiled and told a story about cold feet. Her husband's old car had a cracked radiator, she said, antifreeze for winter months. Anything to make a domestic explanation. She began suggesting to Wesley that sending Will away to a weekend camp might be good for the boy's social development. "He needs space," she said, pinching the hem of his grief like a thing that could be shaped with a suggestion. "Give him a chance to be a child." Will wrote camp in his notebook and underlined it. He drew a small suitcase beside the word and shaded it with a child's attempt at dread. He had seen a pattern history under the new woman's careful hands. Denial in adults is a theater. Grief is a fog. It can be near impossible to cut through with nothing but a blue notepad and a child's insistence. Tension in the house mounted. Small, sharp incidents accumulated like a pile of cut glass. Monica began moving things around late at night, Wesley's pills taken from the bottle and placed in a new container. She cataloged Wesley's checkbook in a way that felt like curiosity at first, then ownership. Wesley, who trusted as a man who had been loved and left, found comfort in the order she produced. He called her darling on the phone sometimes. He laughed more. He mended his shirts with a steadier hand, as if he had been finding reasons to keep himself present in the world. The congregation at Ebenezer continued their rituals. They cooked plates to bring over. They sang the same hymn at funerals and birthdays, because the music itself was scaffolding for living. Will watched them all from the shadows of the back pew sometimes, a small silhouette making lists in his head of things adults would not see until they stumble over them. At school, he answered math problems. He kept his voice small in class, protective of his mission.
He learned to be polite with the neighbors who liked Monica and to smile at Wesley when his father hugged him with the kind of gratitude that made Will feel both loved and exiled. Denise's research dug up more than just a complaint. She found a paper trail with neat signatures and a pattern of marriages that ended sooner than expected. The dates were a geography Will could follow: small towns, quiet obituaries, one-liners in newspapers. She tracked the name changes, the alternate names, and a pattern of beneficiary flips that suggested someone was becoming the financial person of interest soon after the union. None of these things alone would make a case. Together they formed a map you could read. "It's like someone was collecting," Will said once, as if he were trying the word on for size. He did not mean an actual collector. He meant accumulation. She had been gathering husbands the way a tree gathers rings, a new layer added slowly, quietly. Denise did not smile. She explained to Will that real investigations rarely went from a child's notebook to an arrest. They took time. They needed corroboration. A corroboration came in the voice of Lisa Foster. Lisa arrived on Wesley's porch one humid afternoon carrying an old legal file. She looked like a person who had kept grief tight in a fist until someone offered a hand. Her brother, she explained, had been a man who'd loved to fish and to fix things. He had married a woman far away in a chapel with cheap flowers, and then within months, he'd been in the hospital with symptoms no one could explain. The family argued for further testing, for explanations. The death certificate read, complications, a weeping absence of the specificity a family wanted. Lisa had never stopped asking questions. Her complaint had been dismissed by lawyers who thought the case too small to pursue. She had been told to let it go. The world had told her to let it go. Denise listened to Lisa and, with Will watching, laid out a chronology. She set the photocopies on the table and pointed to beneficiary changes, to the timing between marriage and death. She spoke plainly. "This doesn't prove wrongdoing, but it gives us reasonable cause to keep looking." Will felt the gravity of the word reasonable. It was a legal weight, and he held it like a talisman. Denise added that they might be able to get surveillance footage from the CVS where Monica had been seen buying items. Monitors picked up many things, often embarrassments, but sometimes evidence. She said it carefully. Cameras could supply time-stamped proof of presence and purchases that connected to what Lisa had found in the public record. They sent a polite request to the CVS for footage. The company, a behemoth of corporate procedure, replied that it kept footage for 30 days and that security requests had to be routed through legal channels. The exchange was dry, bureaucratic. It added time.
Time in that house meant changeable weather. It meant Wesley's cough moving from wet to harsh. It meant Monica smiling more and closing cabinets with the applique of closure. Pressure mounted with other people's agendas, too. Monica began talking about a wedding. She mentioned venues as casually as if she were shopping for napkins. She used language designed to reassure. "We can have it at Ebenezer. We can keep it small. Your father needs the people." For Wesley, who had lived in the shrine of his marriage, the idea of a new beginning was an antidote. He wanted to feel held again. "Carolyn would want me to be happy," he said to his sister once. That phrase fell like a hammer. Will's notebook took to longer margins. He wrote the names of places Monica mentioned for the ceremony. He wrote the dates she suggested. He wrote down the look on his father's face when Wesley agreed to a Saturday in June. She moved the date up twice, as if pushing time to an earlier finish line. Will underlined the second change, big enough to look like anger. Denise and Will convened their own kind of war room in the back bedroom where Carolyn had once kept dress patterns. Denise taped a calendar to the wall and pinned photocopies: the obituary, the civil complaint, the CVS receipt photocopy that Lisa had tucked into her file. The photocopy of the receipt had a timestamp. It matched, curiously, a period in which one of the earlier husbands had been ill. The coincidence was a red thread. Denise dug further into public resources: phone records, property transfers, banknotes that showed a name change of beneficiary on a life insurance policy. Each fact fit like a puzzle piece. But time and the law are different currencies. Detective Harris visited with the courtesy of someone who liked order. He took the blue notebook and the printed pages and peered at the photocopies like a man trying to keep his temper from deciding the outcome. He said he would run a quiet check, he would not tip off anyone, and he agreed that the pattern was worth watching. He cautioned them about the way courts dislike how evidence arrives: poorly documented, emotionally heavy, collected without official procedure. "We can help," he said, "but we can't bend the rules." That warning about not bending the rules was both a solace and a slamming door to Will. He had for weeks imagined a more immediate rescue, a dramatic telephone call, a van and flashing lights, a heroic reveal. Real life does not move that way. Real life moves in meetings, in memorandums, in the slow alignment of paperwork. Denise kept working anyway. The first night Monica raised her voice to Will, she said it with a calm that was practiced into cruelty. She stood in the hallway with the lampshade haloing her head and told him he was small, less than nothing, something she had to tolerate for the sake of family obligation. "You're a reminder of a life he can't have back," she said, each syllable exact. Will might have crumpled if he were any other child. Instead, he closed his eyes and felt his mother's last words press into him like an instruction: keep him safe. Around that time, Monica began to insist that Wesley finalize a will. She spoke about the practicality of arranging things. She suggested that such matters were best handled quickly. She told Wesley that if anything happened to him, she would make sure everything was taken care of. The phrase, spoken in a voice meant to comfort, sounded to Will like a counting of beads. Will went to church more often, not for service, but for the solace in being among people who knew the cadence of Sunday rituals. He would sit near the back while the choir sang those hymns, notes rising and folding like prayers, and he would feel the world hold a bit. Children at Ebenezer were raised on the soft discipline of being seen. Older women would pat his shoulder and call him name affirmations: "William," "Wesley baby," the way people in small communities cultivate belonging. Denise tried, in the way adults do, to prepare for contingencies. She bought a small lockbox for documents and instructed Will on what to put inside: copies of the photocopied complaint, his mother's obituary photos, the blue notebook. She was careful to teach him how to keep things safe without frightening him. "We don't out the boy," she said once, folding a photocopy into the box. "We protect him with facts." Wesley, meanwhile, was beginning to show the kinds of symptoms that made Denise's gut tighten. He had episodes of nausea that he attributed to diet. He missed the small pragmatic things he had once done without thinking: the car keys, the names of people he had just been told. It was the kind of slow unraveling the photographs don't capture, but which a nurse sees in the way someone runs their hand over a countertop. Hesitation, misplacement, a steady decline in the attention he gave to everyday life. "Maybe it's stress," Monica would say, smoothing a hand over his forearm the way one smooths fabric. "Grief hits people later than you think.
Wesley nodded, because he wanted to believe. Will kept watching. He cataloged episodes of Wesley's forgetfulness and wrote them in the margins of the notebook. Daddy forgot to pay electricity, 5-6. Left keys in car, 5-9. Each entry was a small thrown flag. He began to see the house as a theater where things were being positioned for a performance in which he might be a bit player unless he stood up and raised his voice. The pressure ramped further when Monica brought up the possibility of sending Will to a long-term camp for children. She framed it as a generous offer, an enrichment opportunity. He needs friends his own age, she told Wesley, as if offering a relief. It was easy for Wesley to imagine this as a loving move. He'd been a father in the way of providing, and the idea of Will making new friends was a balm. Will heard the plan as a threat.
In his notebook, he wrote, "If he leaves, no one will tell Daddy what's happening." He shaded the letters with an urgency that felt like a shout in handwriting. He told Denise. She frowned. "If they move the wedding up," she said, "and if they try to get him away, it will be harder to keep the evidence together." And that, more than anything, led to a new kind of strategy. Denise realized they were fighting both the clock of legal process and the clock of domestic maneuvering. Monica, deliberately or not, was compressing time. She spoke about wanting a small ceremony, about how convenient a stadium of friends at Ebenezer could be, about how Wesley deserved to be anchored again. She did not mention in public the civil complaint in Indiana that Lisa had filed. She did not mention the public records that Denise had unearthed. She moved in the world like a woman who knew which doors to open and how to keep them closed. On a humid Friday afternoon, Denise and Will sat on the back step and spread out everything they had. The photocopies formed a fan of evidence: beneficiary changes, dates, the faint photocopy of a CVS receipt with its timestamp, Lisa Foster's complaint, the list in Will's notebook. Will's small hand trembled when he pointed to a date on the calendar. "She wants Saturday the 12th, he said. Denise's face folded. "We have days," she said. "How many?" "3 now," Will answered. He had not meant to say it aloud. The words scraped the air. 3 days to convince a man in love and in grief that his tomorrow was dangerous. 3 days to secure a sample and a surveillance clip and some testimonial weight that would compel an officer to set the machinery of law into motion. Denise stood up too quickly and ran her fingers through her hair. "We have to make every hour count," she muttered. Her voice had that clinical tone of someone balancing urgency with procedure. She started to list things out loud. She wanted a recorded admission, a time-stamped video, a lab-verified sample. She wanted witnesses whose statements couldn't be waved away as emotional. She wanted anything that would force the police's hand. Will folded his hands on his knees and let himself be small and precise. "I can get the iPad," he said. "There's that thing Monica keeps in her purse. She uses it when she thinks no one's watching. Sometimes she talks to herself on it, and I can hear what she says." Denise's eyes narrowed, not with rebuke, but with planning. The iPad was a risk. Evidence out of a purse could be contested, but it was also a way to get a voice recorded. She thought about chain of custody again, about how any recording had to be handled in a way that didn't permit Monica or a defense attorney to claim tampering. The list of risks was long. The alternative, doing nothing, felt like watching a slow tide take someone you loved. "We don't go in alone," she said. "We do this with someone who can make it official. We arrange for a way to have a neutral witness present when we collect anything." She paused. "We need to make them have to look." Will's brain, tuned to smallness and speed, started to make maps in his head. He drew in his notebook a sequence of actions. Collect the iPad, get the lemonade sample officially logged, ask Lisa to write a sworn statement about what she saw with her brother, request CVS footage through the legal channel, and if they refused, get a subpoena through the detective. Each step had a hurdle, but the map existed. For Will, mapping was living. The night before the wedding date was set, Monica shoved him again in that hallway. This time it was harder. It was a shove that told Will she knew he watched her. It was a shove that asked him to vanish. For a moment the world narrowed to the scent of lemon oil from the cleaned counter, to the hum of the refrigerator, to the way his pulse beat in the tender hollow below his throat. He tasted something like iron, fear, or resolve. He straightened, and he did something that children sometimes do when adults underestimate the depth of their courage. He took the shove and turned it into proof. Denise arrived the next morning with a plan partially sewn together and a heart that beat too fast for her usual procedure. She had a phone call scheduled with Detective Harris. She had a polite but formal letter requesting footage from the CVS, stamped and copied. She had Lisa's file with her signature heavy and sure. She had instructions for Will on what to do if Monica tried to isolate him, or if Wesley tried to send him away. "We will not be reckless," she said, "but we will not be stalled either." Will's notebook lay open on the table like a map of the future.
every inked line a step toward a moment when a child might have to become a child's voice raised to the scale of a public confrontation. He felt both tiny and enormous. They had no illusions about the theater of the church. They knew the congregation loved Wesley and would want more than anything to bolster him. They knew also that love can be the very thing a manipulator exploits. Monica had used it before, or at least Denise's map suggested she had. The pieces told a story that was still, for now, only a story, until it could be made into an unassailable truth. There was a clock on the wall that ticked in the living room of the Davis house. The hands moved with small, indifferent politeness. Will watched the clock like an enemy general. He counted the sleeps. He kept adding entries to his notebook. Telephone times, odd phrases, who visited and when. He slept in short bursts. He ate sandwiches because Denise said he had to. He practiced shouting his warning in the hallway in a voice that would carry without sounding hysterical. Outside, the magnolia tree dropped its white petals like small, accidental snow. Ebenezer's organist practiced the prelude to a hymn.
The neighborhood simmered with the predictable: a child riding a bicycle, a neighbor sweeping a stoop, the late afternoon barbecues that made the air smell like home. And inside, two people, the 10-year-old and the forensic nurse, tucked themselves against the tide of procedure and intention and stitched, with the slow urgency of a frightened and determined pair, the beginnings of a case they hoped would force a man to see what his grief had not. As the days folded down toward a Saturday with flowers and pews, the list of things to secure grew longer. Denise had a line to the detective but could not compel urgency. Will had the notebook but needed a means to turn it into evidence the world would accept. Monica continued to set the stage, smiling and arranging, tightening the schedule as if timing could make certainty. The house settled into the kind of silence that precedes unmade decisions. Will pressed his forehead to the window pane and watched children play in the street. He thought about his mother's hands on his face, her last breath making of him a guardian. He thought about the way the word promise had a weight like an heirloom. He thought about how small voices sometimes had to be loud to be heard. 3 days, he could not forget. 3 days to make adults bend to the facts he and Denise had collected. 3 days to make the world, for once, pay attention to what a child had been keeping. He shut his notebook and walked to the door. Outside, the magnolia blossoms were like small fists of light. He knew that the next moves would be high risk, and that the place where he would have to speak would be under bright lights and in the company of people who loved his father. He felt the promise in him hard and bright. Denise checked her phone again, thumb hitting the screen like she was testing time. "If we don't get the footage or a lab confirmation," she said softly, "we might have to force a public reckoning." Will's mouth shaped the words before his brain fully measured them. "We can make it public," he said, "at the wedding." Denise closed her eyes for a second and let out a breath that was part prayer and part calculation. She weighed the risks: humiliation, the chance of being accused of drama, the possibility of being dismissed as overzealous outsiders. She weighed also the cost of waiting: Wesley's health, the possibility that a pattern would continue, that the next name on a beneficiary form would be the only thing anyone noticed after the fact. "Our aim is safety," she said finally, "not spectacle." Will thought of the hallway shove. He thought of the lemonade pitcher. He thought of a small family portrait with his mother's smile caught like a memory on glossy paper. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and put the notebook inside, its blue cover folded against his chest like a shield. They had yet to secure the surveillance clip from CVS. They had yet to arrange a way to ensure the lemonade sample would have a procedural chain of custody. They had yet to get Detective Harris to take a step that would bring law to bear. The house hummed with imminent decisions. On Thursday, when the church bells rang in the late afternoon and the sun set like honey across Maple Street, Will did something he had not told anyone he would do. He climbed into the attic and took down the old camcorder Wesley had used on family holidays, the one with a ribbon of dust across the lens. He brushed it clean, loaded the battery he found. He wiped the dust from the lens with the corner of his shirt and thumbed the power switch. The camcorder coughed to life, a green light answering like a small promise. Will set it on the dresser facing the doorway with the kind of deliberateness a boy gives to a chess piece. He did not know exactly what he hoped to catch. He only knew he had to try. "If this matters to you, stay with us to the end," Denise whispered, half to Will and half to the small humming house. It was the kind of soft appeal she used when she wanted someone to hold a fact in their mind until it could be proved. They worked with a list: secure the iPad, get the lemonade sample into the lab, find the CVS footage, and nail down witness statements that could not be brushed aside as the sentimental clamor of a child.
Each item on the list had 1,000 small hazards: time, technique, suspicion. Each item had to be handled with the patience of a lockpicker and the ethics of a nurse. The camcorder was crate and altar both. Will wanted to capture Monica alone, the way she sometimes fretted to herself or hummed when she thought nobody was listening. Denise suggested the attic camera as an adjunct to the iPad plan, a raw analog voice recorder that lessened the risk of a single-device defense challenge. They placed it at an angle where Monica's chair in the back bedroom would be visible through the thin crack of an ajar door. That night, Will lay awake with the blue notebook beneath his chin and a hollow space of fear in his stomach he had learned to translate into lists. He imagined the camcorder catching the rustle of fabric, a muttered name, a half-laugh that might be used in court one day as a timestamp of intent. He imagined nothing. He imagined everything. He wrote a final note before sleep swallowed him. "If I get caught, tell them I was saving Daddy." Then he slept, light and feigned, like a sentry. By Thursday morning, Denise had arranged a way to fast-track the lemonade sample to a forensic toxicology lab she trusted from previous cases. She could not hand it to the police with absolute chain of custody preserved. She had no official kit, no accession number, but she could get a lab to run a screening and produce a preliminary report that would at least flag the presence of toxins.
Labs, like people, often answered to proof shown with quiet professionalism. A formal request accompanied by a vetted nurse's signature carried weight. She drove to the lab with Will's cup wrapped in a small paper bag and her own reticence bundled tight. The technician took the sample with a calm that did not cheapen the moment. "We'll screen it for common toxicants," he said, professional, concrete. There was an implied caution in his voice. Initial screens can be suggestive but not definitive. It was enough to be a start. Simultaneously, Denise followed up the CVS lead. She had written a formal request through corporate channels earlier in the week, but corporate took time to respond. She phoned back and explained, carefully, without alarm, the public safety dimension. The clerk she spoke with had a bureaucratic empathy, someone who worked inside 1,000 corporate policies and carried them like quilts. "We keep footage for 30 days, she said, "and legal requests go through our loss prevention office." Denise left loaner copies of the complaint and a case summary that read like a small, polite plea. The clerk promised to escalate. They did not know then if escalation would produce tape or silence. They had to behave as if the tape existed and as if it did not. Will and Denise rehearsed their choices again and again until plans felt like worn shoes. The moment they'd collect the iPad, how they'd present the sample to the lab chain in a way to limit challenge, and how they would make the public revelations so overwhelming that hesitation would be political and moral, not procedural. On Friday afternoon, a small miracle of paperwork arrived in Denise's inbox, a clipped corporate-speak email with an attachment, a single minute of grainy surveillance from a midnight purchase at the Maple Street CVS. Monica appeared in a dark hoodie, the timestamp blinking 11:46 p.m. She moved like someone who knows eyes are near, but thinks the cheapness of a camera will render it invisible. In the clip, she paused between aisles, glanced left and right, and then placed a small container into the basket. The camera's angle captured the product circle on the package, a bottle that might have been antifreeze. She paid with a credit card that matched a name Denise had found in public records. It was not explosive on its own, but it fit the other nodes on the map. Will watched the looped footage with the kind of calm attention he had learned from his mother's bedside. "That's the same label," he murmured, pointing with the pencil he'd used to underline dates. His voice did not shake. The image of Monica placing a gloved hand over the bottle, an oddity for a midnight run, sat on the screen like a small, accusing finger. Then came the lab's call. The toxicology report was a clustered sentence that read like a medical whisper. The screening returned a positive for glycols consistent with ethylene glycol exposure. It was not complete. The lab insisted on confirmatory testing to quantify and rule out contamination. But consistent with was enough to make Detective Harris, who had been watching the case with the measured skepticism of his profession, sit up straighter. He requested a meeting. Denise pushed as far as she dared without breaking procedure. She walked into the station with printed copies of the CVS footage, photocopies of beneficiary changes, Lisa Foster's signed complaint, and the camcorder's SD card tucked in the zipped envelope. Harris inspected everything with the same efficiency he used to file reports. He talked about warrants and deadlines, and the risk of evidence being thrown out for lack of an official chain. He reminded them, "We need probable cause to proceed. Emotion will not carry a case." Denise did not need a lecture about legal threshold. She needed a partner to translate the story they had assembled into probable cause. She had worked the system long enough to know the correct combination of facts and pressure.
Publicity could nudge the slow-moving cogs of law if it did not betray the carefully collected evidence. Harris agreed to shadow them at the wedding, not to arrest on sight, but to observe and intervene if necessary. He agreed to draft a warrant in the event something definitive appeared. They had 3 days. On Friday evening, Will reviewed the plan with the steadiness of someone rehearsing lines for the only play that might save the stage. He would sit near the back of the church, a place where boys sometimes fell asleep during sermons, and where he could see his father without being conspicuous. The iPad, if they could get it, would be quietly connected to a speaker Denise borrowed from a friend at the church. If the evidence could be played aloud so everyone could hear, then the mechanics of disbelief, but polite refusal to see what was staring at them, would be harder to maintain. It was a high-risk move, and Denise said so. She measured every possibility that her conscience allowed, and then made a choice. The cost of public humiliation would be less than the cost of silence if Monica continued a pattern of harm. "We will not weaponize shame," she said, "but we will use truth in a place where silence protects the wrong thing." On Saturday morning, Monica moved through the house with a softness designed to look like domestic peace. She pressed flowers into vases, reorganized Wesley's socks into tidy stacks, and walked the rooms like a person arranging a narrative. She bent to straighten the framed picture of Carolyn on the mantel in a way that looked like apology and proprietary reminder at once. Wesley, who had thought the ceremony would be an antidote to grief, felt buoyed. He joked with neighbors who appeared early, took too many selfies with his phone, and signed a card with the trembling hand of a man practicing joy.
He had always been quick to gratitude, and gratitude is a lens that can hide shadows. His eyes found the light that Monica arranged and lingered there. Will sat in the back with Denise at his side, the church filling with the warm hum of a community morning. The organist warmed the prelude, and the choir ran up a scale like people inhaling hope. The scent of lemon oil and fried fish from last night's rehearsal dinner seemed distant. The air inside Ebenezer was heavy with affection, and the kind of ritual that binds a neighborhood around a man who had been loved, and whose love they still treasured. Will felt his heartbeat in his throat. He had practiced the words he would shout, so they would carry without hysteria. "Don't marry her." He had practiced what he would say after, the short collage of facts that would make the congregation ask itself a question. How did we miss this? He had also practiced silence, how to let a silence widen, until the sound of a recording filled the room. The ceremony began in a way the Davis house had always known. Small talk, the rustle of programs, a hush that drew breath in from the bell tower. Monica walked up the aisle on Wesley's arm, smiling like a woman who knew the choreography of belonging. Wesley's face was open with love. People leaned forward. The pastor said words about mercy and second chances. The congregation sang. Will could feel the moment when his mother's picture would be brushed aside to make room for the new family portrait Monica clearly anticipated. He could see his father's smile closing like a hand over a letter. The plan unrolled in his head. Interrupt, play the evidence, force an urgent call to authorities. He stood when Denise gave him a small nod and a look that asked for courage and offered protection. He walked up the center aisle with the conviction of someone who carries a lighthouse inside his chest. He passed faces he had known since childhood, and some he had only known to greet from a distance. He climbed the few steps to the front, and with a single breath, let his voice out. "Don't marry her," he shouted. The sound cut through the hymn like an axe through silk. Heads turned. A silence like a held breath spread through the pews. For a moment people didn't know if they should laugh, scold, or cry. Then Will moved hands trembling around the iPad Denise had placed in his backpack and tapped the screen. A clip played. Crisp. Private. The camera's angle catching Monica in the back bedroom the night before. She spoke in a voice that was near whisper, but audible on the recording. "When his head isn't clear, he signs. You know he will. You make the papers about some small wrong, and they back away. It's always the lonely ones. You just make them need you, and you collect what they leave." The words landed like unexpected weather. There was a murmur of shock. Monica's face became a study in color changes, the practiced smile curving toward a defense she had not rehearsed for. Wesley's face went blank, as if someone had lifted the palette of his life and shown him a shade he did not know existed. Denise's hands moved without melodrama. She had rehearsed this possible play. A recorded admission, a surveillance clip, a lab note. Another recording played, grainy audio from Monica's phone, where she could be heard speaking on a call. "Rachel, remember, Make the water taste funny. Keep him sleepy. The forms come easier that way. The church fell into an audible intake of breath. The pastor's mouth formed an O someone might have swallowed. Monica stood, her composure fraying like an old curtain. "This is a lie," she said, voice high and thin. But the clip continued. A second surveillance sequence showed the CVS purchase, time-stamped late at night with the familiar bottle circled by the clerk's annotation. People shifted in their pews. Wesley's hand went to his chest as if to steady his heart against an unseen shock. Will had expected people to cry, to shout, to do what disbelief does, invent reasons to keep the world as it had been. He had not expected the full force of the congregation's love to turn into a weapon for truth. There were people he knew, women who had brought casseroles and sat up with Wesley at night, sitting with a dawning horror that translated into action. An older woman in the front, who had been friends with Carolyn for decades, stood and lifted her hand, not to scold Will, but to signal for someone to call 911. Wesley reached for his phone with a hand that trembled, his fingers clumsy on the screen. He dialed. His voice when he spoke was small and fractured. "This is Wesley Davis. Please come to Ebenezer. My house. It's complicated." His breath held and then broke. A man in grief had been given a map of truth and did not know how to read it. Monica moved to the side like someone who had been blindsided. She tried to go, to leave the church quietly, to retreat into the hallway where the exit lay. But outside the sanctuary doors, urban civility had been prearranged into something like a net. Detective Harris and a pair of uniformed officers appeared at the threshold like professional punctuation. They had not been there at random. Denise's call and the recorded admissions pressed the machinery of caution into motion. Monica's movement quickened. She turned, then spun, then pushed past people who reached to stop her. The iPad dropped to the floor with a soft click in the sacred acoustics. Denise and a couple of neighbors, people who had seen their own loved ones cared for by Wesley, blocked the door. Monica shoved beyond them with a force people didn't expect her to have. She tried the side door. Will chased her to the vestibule, breath and adrenaline making his child's mems into temporary engines. Monica saw an opening and bolted. She ran out into a small cluster of cars, a humid breeze lifting her hair into a halo. The officers gave chase.
A neighbor who had been a retired security guard intercepted her at the curb. Detective Harris reached her first, hands on the collar like a father catching someone who was about to break. "You're under arrest," Harris said, voice even and no nonsense. There was handcuff clicking that sounded like a metronome, measured, inexorable. Monica's protest made a sound that was part shriek and part pleading. She did not resist in a way that would have made headlines. There was no slamming or theatrical fight, only an abrupt reduction of motion, like the end of a recorded thing. They brought her to the station that afternoon. She sat in a quiet room with the kind of sterility that removes the texture of a home. Harris read her rights. His face was level with the incidental gravity of duty. He had watched a child's evidence align with surveillance and lab work. The combination made a chain that, while not perfect, was ugly enough with truth to be useful. The initial medical tests for Wesley, run in the emergency room once an attending physician insisted, came back more conclusive than anyone had dared hope. The presence of ethylene glycol metabolites in his blood explained the neurological symptoms his family had brushed aside as aging or stress, confusion, episodes of disorientation, the creeping fatigue that had turned details into riddles. The hospital kept him overnight for monitoring and began supportive treatment to metabolically clear the toxin, careful language from the clinicians reminding everyone present that each case differs and that recovery would be slow. When the news leaked through Maple Street, the neighborhood followed like a flock. People brought casseroles again, but this time with the tenderness of a community who had nearly failed and had been given a chance to make a different choice. The church held impromptu prayers and called for congregational support. The pastor organized a small committee to visit Wesley, to hold his place in the world as the medical teams did their work. Meanwhile, Denise pursued the remaining pieces with calm ferocity. The camcorder Forta took covered from the bedroom, and the audio from the iPad formed a strand that Detective Harris used to obtain a warrant for Monica's devices and to seek permission for an exhumation of one of her previous husband's remains from the county medical examiner. Exhumation is a heavy word in a small town. It is a thing families dread, a legal procedure that strips rumor into forensic possibility. Lisa Foster, who had never stopped asking for answers about her brother, stood with Denise and Will when the county moved to reopen the case. Her voice in the hearings was measured and durable. Weeks of testing turned into a clearer pattern. The toxicology on the exhumate remains returned results consistent with chronic exposure to ethylene glycol, low but repeated levels, that, in the absence of a documented accidental exposure, raised the same pattern Denise had traced in records.
The medical examiner's report was careful to state what could be reasonably inferred and what could not, but the implication girded the civil picture Denise had painted. Someone had gained materially, and when the subject's health eroded, they had been there to consolidate benefits. Monica's arraignment was a quiet affair compared to the drama of her arrest. She sat in the defendant's chair with a face that had, over time, gone from performative composure to a less defined exhaustion. Charges were filed, counts that reflected suspected financial exploitation, and the more serious allegations tied to poisoning. The district attorney's office moved cautiously, mindful of the burden of proof, but the evidence's geometry was no longer a child's drawing. It was a mounting set of facts: the beneficiary flips, the public records, the CVS receipt, the camcorder audio, the iPad recordings, the lab results, and the corroborating testimony of a sister who had lost a brother. Wesley's recovery was not a single moment, but a slow series of small clarities. At first, he could not recall the names of neighbors who had been in his life for decades. He misremembered the price of milk. Those things, which are everyday measures of personhood, returned like sunlight through curtains, gradual, not immediate. He had periods of fatigue and memory gaps that were explained in clear, kind terms by his doctors. He began occupational therapy as a way to relearn tasks he had once performed by habit: making a pot of coffee in the morning without burning it, reading his mail, remembering to lock the back door. Will stood beside him at every appointment, like a watchman who had kept his word. In the weeks that followed, the Datus home became a place of repair in more ways than one. Neighbors volunteered to paint the porch, the old sagging structure lifted with new boards and a coat of blue that matched the sky on Sundays. The photo of Carolyn came down from the mantel for cleaning. Wesley sat with it in his lap and told Will small, offhand stories about their mother: the way she arranged silverware, the absurdity of her laugh when she watched an old movie. Those stories were stitches to a new everyday life. Will, who had carried the blue notebook with him into the courtroom and the kitchen and church, found his notebook heavy with a different kind of weight: the record of duty kept now as an artifact of survival. Denise made a copy of its pages to be preserved in case any questions arose later. Will allowed it without fuss, like a boy handing over a trophy to a museum. He continued to sleep in his own bed, the magnolia breeze tapping the window, and he learned to be small again in ways that were not all defense. He began to laugh more genuinely at school jokes. He took part in small household tasks, the folding of shirts, the rinsing of plates, and came to relish the ordinariness of being someone's son, not only his father's protector. Not all questions found neat endings.
The legal system, with its steady economy of time and precedent, moved at its own pace. Some matters would require depositions, subpoenas, and a patience that made Will squirm in a way he had not before. But the more pressing things were settled. Monica was no longer in the house, Wesley's condition was being treated, and there were arrests and indictments that meant the state had enough probable cause to proceed. There were quiet reckonings, too. Members of the congregation felt the guilt of having missed small signs. Others felt the exhaustion of loving in a world where love could be weaponized. The pastor encouraged a frame of compassion, without contradiction, an insistence that grief doesn't excuse predation. People volunteered for check-ins, for rides to doctor's appointments, for a steady presence that could shield the vulnerable from isolation, a common vector in exploitation. Denise went back to her forensic notes and filed them with the kind of meticulous order that made them harder to dismiss later. She counseled Will on what might happen in court and what it would mean to speak there. Will did not like the idea of being in a courtroom again, but he understood that his testimony, his voice, his notebook, his recollections had changed the arc of a life. He had acted because a promise had been made to him by a mother whose last breath had entrusted him with a duty. When the initial hearings concluded and Monica's indictment moved forward, the news made its slow arc through local papers and online community boards. Some people commented in ways that were cruel and immediate. Others offered empathy and the kinds of prayers that do more than words. Letters arrived at the house, handwritten notes from neighbors, a small bouquet from the woman who ran the corner deli, a plate of cookies from the church's youth group with a child's scrawl that read, "Stay strong, Mr. Wesley." The kindnesses were stitches of a very practical kind. Wesley, in a moment that felt both private and public, invited a small group of neighbors and friends to a potluck at the house to thank them for their presence. He stood in the kitchen, apron tied around his waist, and fumbled through a recipe he had never quite managed before. Will sat at the table and watched his father learn to fold collards the way Carolyn had shown him, patient hands showing the small mercy of practice. The scene was domestic and ordinary, and that ordinariness was the very best evidence of repair. There were moments of apology, too. People who had initially liked Monica because she had made the house feel whole came to Wesley with apologies they did not know how to shape.
Their faces were sincere. They had not acted from malice, only from the human tendency to seek comfort in a difficult hour. Wesley accepted some apologies with the weary grace of a man learning to choose his own pace of trust. He declined others with a firm politeness that recognized boundaries.
Lisa Foster, who had once been told to let her brother's death rest as misfortune, found herself in a room where the facts she had insisted on were finally being taken seriously. She read a statement at the small hearing that wished the system would have listened earlier, a remark tempered by the endurance of someone who'd lived with grief and accusation for years. "I didn't know what I was saying meant anything," she told the court. "I just kept saying things until someone looked." Her voice broke but held. People reached across small aisles to squeeze her hand. Over months, there were court appearances, depositions, and forensic confirmations. The medical examiner's careful words and testimony about low-level chronic exposure and the way it can erode systems slowly gave the jury a language for what had been a child's instinct. The prosecution did not page through melodrama, and neither did the defense. The law moved in its cautious way, attentive to precedent, to admissible evidence, to the careful calibration of statements. In time, the criminal matter advanced to a point where a plea were considered, and investigative searches yielded more corroborating items, bank statements, emails, a string of beneficiary paperwork that matched the pattern Denise had outlined. Monica was charged with multiple counts that reflected the breadth of the alleged conduct: financial exploitation, administering a substance causing harm, and related charges. The public would eventually learn how the case resolved in formal legal terms. For the Davis family, the immediate relief came in more daily forms. Wesley could walk the dog again without forgetting the leash. He could sit with Will in the front yard without his thoughts being a scatter of missing pieces. They repaired the home in other ways, too. The magnolia tree got a trimming and a new seat built at its base, where Wesley and Will would sit in the evenings and talk about nothing and everything. They placed a small lamp on the mantel beside Carolyn's restored photograph, and sometimes, when they felt the ache of absence, they lit it like a small lighthouse. The portrait no longer felt like an accusation of loss, but a reminder of what had been loved and what could be loved again. Will found himself less watchful in the way of being ready to raise an alarm, and more watchful in the way of noticing the small joys his mother had loved, the sweetness of a peach, the way sunlight caught the edge of a page, the rhythm of a hymn that he could now sing without thinking of danger. He rejoined his school soccer team and learned how to throw a better curveball. He discovered, slowly, that being brave did not always mean shouting in a sanctuary. Sometimes it meant helping his father with breakfast. Denise, who had become more than a friend to the family, more a guardian with a notepad, kept visiting. She came to Thanksgiving when the table was crowded and the house warm. She sat beside Wesley, and they did not speak much about court or the evidence. They spoke about small things, like how the new curtains fit the kitchen, and whether the roast needed a little more time. Her role, once tightly wound to investigation, softened into something like neighborliness, an adulthood that could sustain both truth-seeking and the comfort of casseroles. In the end of the long arc of hearings and tests, when law had done as much as law could do, the house settled into a place with fewer sharp edges. Friends from church stayed the course. People learned, as people do, to be better curators of each other's safety. The community organized a small neighborhood watch that included a roster of elders who promised to check in routinely. It was not a perfect fix. People still whispered sometimes about the drama that had touched their Sunday, and some lamented the fragility of trust, but the overall motion had been toward repair. One evening, months after the arrest, Will stood on the back porch with a paintbrush and helped his father score the wall with a careful stroke. They were restoring the porch swing Carolyn had loved. Wesley's hand, which had once trembled with a fog of memory, was steadier now. "You did good," he said quietly, not grandly, not theatrically, but with a cadence that felt like returning names to their rightful place. "You did too," Will replied. He had learned that praise is a currency fathers and sons can exchange when the work of life is heavy. Wesley hugged him then, not in a way that erased the past, but in a way that held it like a folded cloth, something to be kept, used, stored carefully. In the quiet that followed, Will took down his blue notebook and set it on the mantel beside Carolyn's photograph. He closed it slowly and touched the worn edges. The notebook had been a ledger of small observations and a relic of a child's sharp duty. He did not know what the future would ask of him next, but he knew this: he had kept a promise. The house would be safer because he had spoken. His voice had not been dismissed forever. There was no cinematic moment of complete victory, no magic that reversed wrongs, but there was a new daily choreography of care.
Wesley learned to cook collard greens properly, using a recipe that sometimes burned and sometimes soared, and Will took pride in the times it turned out just right. They rejoined the life of Maple Street in the small ways that matter, going to the bakery on Saturdays, sitting in the church choir loft when they could, and answering the call of neighbors who needed a listening ear. Denise continued her work. Cases would come and go, and she would sometimes think of that blue notebook and the 10-year-old who had made a decision that altered the arc of a life. She kept in touch with Lisa Foster, who had gained new footing after the exhumation confirmed the suspicions that had haunted her family.
They spoke about the odd ways justice and community can intersect. Sometimes the courts were the right avenue, sometimes it was the making public of truth in a place where silence had been dangerous. Years later, the story of the wedding crash would live in snippets, neighborhood lore, a piece in the local paper, a lesson in the church's small group about listening to the vulnerable. Some people would remember the shock of the Sunday. Some would remember the child who had stood and screamed into a congregation. For those who had been there, Will, Wesley, Denise, Lisa, the pastor, and many neighbors, the memory was more complicated. It was relief and rawness, grief and gratitude, braided into a single strand. One day, at the house warmed by late afternoon light, Will climbed a step stool and hung the photograph of Carolyn back on the mantel with new nails. Wesley came behind him and placed a small frame beside it, a candid of Will laughing, captured at a soccer game months after the trial. They stood together and looked at the mantel like people who had learned a new habit of hope. "We did what she asked," Will said simply. Wesley's voice was steady, with a kind of exhausted joy. "You did," he replied. "She would be proud of you." The magnolia cast its long shadow across Maple Street that evening as the sun leaned toward the horizon. Children chased one another on the sidewalks, someone baked bread, someone else fiddled with a porch swing. Church bells rang for evening prayer, a sound that felt now like a hymn of ordinary life, a life that had been tested and had, by the slow labor of truth and community, been set toward healing. If there was a single moral that threaded through the months of investigation and the quieter years of recovery, it was not the triumph of law over malice, nor the perfection of community response. It was rather the persistence of small voices and the obligation to listen to them with care. A 10-year-old had screamed into a sanctuary and been believed by people who had the courage to follow the evidence. That belief, bolstered by a nurse's forensic eye, a detective's procedural patience, and a neighbor's testimony, made the difference between a pattern continuing and a life being saved. Will's blue notebook remained on the mantel for a while, its edges softened by time and handling. Occasionally, neighbors would glimpse it and ask about it in quiet tones. Will would smile and say, "My mom told me to take care of Daddy. I did what she asked." The answers were never easy, but they were honest. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear a reminder. Small voices matter, community can act with grace, and the work of protecting one another sometimes starts with a single, brave interruption.